May 9th, 1989. Country music fans woke up to heartbreak. Keith Whitley, the soulful voice behind Don't Close Your Eyes, was found dead in his Nashville home. The official cause? Alcohol poisoning. But not everyone believed that. There were whispers about missing items, a security system that mysteriously shut off, and one final phone call from Keith's landline that no one has ever explained. A half-empty vodka bottle was staged beside his bed, but those closest to him said he'd been sober for weeks. And when an unknown man was seen leaving the property just moments before the paramedics arrived, the entire timeline began to unravel. For over 30 years, the music industry has quietly moved on. But deep in the shadows of Music Row, there's a growing belief. Keith Whitley didn't just die. He was silenced. And what he was planning next would have changed everything. Keith Whitley was born to sing pain. Raised in the Appalachian foothills of Sandy Hook, Kentucky, he didn't just grow up on country music. He was molded by it. From the time he was a child, tragedy hung over him like a shadow. At the age of 9, he was already performing in contests. By 13, he had survived a car crash that killed his friend and left Keith with a shattered collarbone. Some said he carried guilt from that accident for the rest of his life. But where others saw loss, Keith found a way to turn it into sound. In his teens, he joined forces with Ricky Skaggs, and the two prodigies became local legends on the bluegrass circuit. Their talents eventually caught the attention of Ralph Stanley, the bluegrass godfather, who invited them into the Clinch Mountain Boys. Keith was just 17, but he had the voice of a man who had lived 100 lives. Even then, people said his songs didn't sound performed. They sounded survive. It wasn't long before Nashville came calling, but with that call came the pressure to conform, to produce, to push out hits. Keith's talent was undeniable, but so was his internal battle. He drank, and not casually. Alcohol became both a crutch and a cage. Yet despite his demons, he climbed fast. His solo career exploded with the 1988 release of Don't Close Your Eyes, which shot to #1 and earned him CMA's top new male vocalist. Suddenly, Keith was everywhere. Radio, television, award shows, and people began whispering that he was the next George Jones, the next Randy Travis, maybe even bigger. But something lingered beneath the surface. Interviews would occasionally capture him distracted, distant. Close friends described him as emotionally intense, always writing, always worrying. In private moments, Keith expressed frustration with his record label, claiming they were watering down his sound, burying his best songs, and restricting his artistic control. And then, something changed. In early 1989, just months before his death, Keith stopped drinking. He started journaling daily. He began meeting with independent producers. He told multiple people he had something big planned, an album with full creative freedom, a label of his own, and a plan to expose what he called the rotten bottom of the business. He was turning a corner, gearing up for a rebirth, but instead, he was found dead. And none of the pieces left behind fit the version the public was told. To the public, Keith Whitley and Lorrie Morgan were country music's golden couple, a dream pairing of two rising stars, whose voices could melt radio waves and whose chemistry lit up award shows. But behind closed doors, their marriage was a storm of passion, pressure, and pain. Keith's battles with alcohol strained the relationship to its limits. Lorrie, a devoted wife and performer in her own right, had tried time and again to get him help. There were fights, separations, late-night disappearances, but there were also moments of tenderness, dreams of a family, and talks of a future they both hoped for if Keith could stay sober. By early 1989, things seemed to be turning around. Keith had recently completed a round of sobriety and was showing up to the studio on time, sharp, focused. He and Lorrie had just moved into a beautiful home in Nashville. He spoke about their son, Jesse, with a calm pride. He was writing more than ever and had begun quietly working on songs that were very different, lyrically darker, emotionally raw, and deeply critical of the corporate machinery behind Nashville's glittering facade. He didn't want another radio hit. He wanted to tell the truth. And that's when things started to get strange. Keith told his bandmates he was being watched. Not followed exactly, but he'd seen unfamiliar faces parked outside his home more than once. Lorrie herself later said Keith had grown increasingly paranoid, especially after meeting with an attorney about starting his own label. He wanted to buy back his masters, fund his own tours, and break away from the contracts that had dictated every step of his career. But those contracts were worth millions, not just to Keith, but to the people around him, executives, promoters, even other artists. Breaking away would mean disrupting a chain of profits tied to Keith's name, voice, and likeness, and not everyone was happy about it. Then there were the missing things. After his death, several personal items couldn't be found. A journal Keith carried everywhere, gone. A briefcase he never let out of his sight, vanished. His studio reel from an unreleased acoustic session recorded days before, never recovered. A friend who had last seen the briefcase said it contained letters and documents Keith didn't trust anyone else to see. And then there was the most disturbing detail: a phone call. According to phone records later reviewed by investigators, someone placed a call from Keith's landline just hours before he died. The number? A private line tied to a music industry executive who publicly claimed he hadn't spoken to Keith in over a year. That executive has never explained the discrepancy, and no one has seen the briefcase since. The final hours of Keith Whitley's life are filled with shadows, missing time, unexplained behavior, and a creeping sense that someone else might have been in the house. His brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, was the last person to see him alive. Lane brought Keith coffee around 8:30 a.m., later saying Keith was tired, but in good spirits, lounging in bed and talking about plans for the afternoon. There were no slurred words, no signs of intoxication, nothing unusual. Lane left the house expecting to see Keith later that day. When he returned around 12:30 p.m., everything had changed. Keith was dead, face down on the bed, a half-empty vodka bottle nearby. No note, no signs of struggle. Just a silence so cold it felt staged. Paramedics arrived shortly after and quietly began to question what they were seeing. One EMT later said, off the record, that the scene didn't feel right. There were inconsistencies. Keith's lips were bruised, his knuckles red, as if he'd fallen forward or struggled briefly. But none of this made it into the official report. Instead, the public was told Keith drank himself to death in bed. But that's not what the medical examiner's office first suspected. Behind closed doors, there was early talk of foul play. A toxicology report showed a blood alcohol level of 47, high enough to kill a man. But Keith was known to have a high tolerance, and friends swore he had been sober for weeks. No pills were found, no drug traces, just alcohol. But when a second toxicology test was quietly requested by the family, it was denied. No explanation, no appeal. The home's alarm system, recently installed, was also a mystery. It had been disarmed at exactly 10:01 a.m., just minutes before a 3-minute phone call was placed from Keith's house to an unlisted number connected to a now-defunct Nashville law office. The firm had ties to royalty disputes and lawsuits filed by artists against major labels. When questioned years later, no one at the firm recalled speaking with Keith. The phone line in question was disconnected within days of his death. Even stranger, a neighbor across the street reported seeing a man leaving the Whitley home around 10:15 a.m., tall, wearing a suit, carrying a leather briefcase. Police were never able to identify him. Security footage? None. The new camera system installed at the home had reportedly malfunctioned that morning. Lorrie Morgan, still performing at the time, said she tried to call Keith around 10:30 a.m., but got no answer. She later said she had a terrible feeling in her gut that something had gone wrong. When she arrived home and learned what had happened, she reportedly collapsed in the driveway. But the questions never stopped. Who was the man seen leaving the house? Why was Keith making phone calls to untraceable numbers? And why When the most promising voice in country music died under mysterious circumstances, did everyone seem so eager to close the case? In the weeks following Keith Whitley's death, the country music world mourned publicly. But behind the scenes, something strange was happening. Instead of a careful investigation into the final hours of a major star's life, there was a rush to sanitize the story. Executives moved quickly to repackage Keith's legacy, push his final recordings into production, and frame the tragedy as a cautionary tale about addiction. The message was clear. Keith drank himself to death, and that was that. But his family didn't agree. Not entirely. Lorrie Morgan, devastated and reeling from the loss, began noticing strange gaps in the story. Keith's personal journal, where he had written almost daily, was gone. A revolver he kept under his pillow, one he'd purchased during his paranoid final weeks, was never logged by police. His songwriting notebooks, which were always left on his nightstand, had vanished. And that locked briefcase he carried to and from the studio, Lorrie never saw it again. Studio engineers who had worked with Keith in his final months recalled something odd. Multiple tracks from his last recording session were missing when they went back to mix the masters. These weren't unfinished takes. They were final cuts, songs that had touched on deeper issues, possibly even exposing inner-circle business dealings Keith had grown disillusioned with. One engineer claimed a particular song titled "They Won't Let Me Speak" was recorded just 2 days before Keith died. That tape has never surfaced. Even more concerning was the pressure the family began to feel. One of Keith's cousins, who spoke publicly about wanting the case re-examined, said she received anonymous phone calls warning her to let it go. A journalist who tried to publish a piece suggesting there were inconsistencies in the coroner's timeline was threatened with legal action from unnamed parties in the industry. Meanwhile, a quiet battle over Keith's estate began to unfold. Several figures with ties to his label made moves to acquire rights to his unpublished material, including demos stored in out-of-state studios. Some of those negotiations were fast-tracked. Contracts signed before the funeral even took place. And then there was the matter of the insurance. Just weeks before his death, Keith had updated his life insurance policy to reflect changes in ownership for his masters. A new beneficiary had been added. That person's name was redacted in the only public version of the document. To this day, no one outside a sealed court record knows who inherited that piece of Keith's music. All that's known is that the policy was claimed within 72 hours of his passing, before an official death certificate was even issued. The business of country music kept moving forward, but the deeper truths surrounding Keith Whitley were quietly buried, alongside the man himself. In 1990, just a year after Keith Whitley's death, a longtime session guitarist who had worked with Keith came forward with an unsettling claim. He said that Keith had recorded a series of private demos in the final weeks of his life, songs that were raw, stripped down, and filled with cryptic messages. One in particular stuck with him. It was a slow, mournful track called "The Silence Is Paid For." According to the guitarist, Keith introduced it by saying, "This one probably won't ever see the light of day unless something happens to me." The tape, like so many others, was never found, but the story didn't die there. In 1993, a studio intern in Nashville claimed to have heard a bootleg cassette of that very recording. She said it featured Keith singing about being watched, controlled, and warned to stay quiet. When she tried to make a copy, the original tape was reportedly removed from the studio and never returned. A few months later, that intern left the music industry completely. She refused to speak about it again. By the early 2000s, a new generation of country fans began digging deeper into Keith's legacy. Online forums lit up with questions. Why was there no detailed coroner's report? Why did several of Keith's unreleased songs disappear from the studio archives? And why did a man who seemed on the verge of personal and professional redemption suddenly wind up dead, alone, silent, and surrounded by contradictions? In 2006, a journalist named Walter Raines attempted to reopen the conversation. He began writing a book titled Whitley: The Notes They Buried, centered on interviews with family members, former producers, and law enforcement officials. But just 6 months into the project, he stopped returning calls. His publisher canceled the book, citing creative differences. Rains moved out of Nashville and disappeared from public view. Some believe he was paid off. Others think he was threatened. One of the last people he interviewed was a retired paramedic who had responded to the Whitley residence that day in 1989. The man claimed he saw a burn mark on Keith's chest, something inconsistent with alcohol poisoning. He said the mark looked like a taser wound. He was never called to testify. That detail never made the report. The deeper people looked, the more inconsistencies they found. But each time someone got close to the truth, the trail went cold. Like the song Keith had reportedly written in his final days, it seemed that silence wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced, and it had a price. Years after Keith Whitley's death, a new clue emerged, not in a courtroom or police file, but from an unexpected source. A retired tour manager named Ben Foster, who had worked briefly with Keith during his early solo career. In a taped interview from 2013, Foster revealed something he'd never spoken about publicly. In the weeks before Keith died, there were 3 men who kept showing up around the recording studio. They never gave names, they weren't part of Keith's team, but they always seemed to be watching, lurking. According to Foster, one of the men wore a lapel pin that matched an executive division of a major Nashville label, a label Keith was reportedly trying to leave. Foster said that Keith once pulled him aside and whispered, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Foster thought it was a joke at the time, but the look in Keith's eyes, that stayed with him. Even more disturbing, Foster recalled a moment just 2 days before Keith's death when he caught one of those men standing outside Keith's parked car, peering into the driver's side window. When confronted, the man said he was just making sure the vehicle was secure. The next morning, Keith reportedly found his glove compartment ransacked. He joked about it on the phone with a friend, saying, "They're searching for ghosts. I've already hidden the good stuff." But what was the good stuff? Rumors began to swirl of a secret folder Keith kept hidden. Some said it contained unreleased lyrics. Others believed it was something far more explosive, evidence of industry corruption, rigged royalty schemes, and forged contracts. Keith had supposedly stumbled across paperwork linking several high-profile artists to a fraudulent publishing ring that skimmed millions from their earnings. Whether or not he had planned to go public remains unknown, but one thing was certain: he had started asking questions. After Foster's interview aired on a local podcast, strange things began happening again. The episode was mysteriously removed from all platforms within days. Foster received a cease and desist letter from an anonymous legal firm, and the original recording of the interview deleted by the station's internal error, they claimed. Fans who remembered hearing the interview before it was taken down say Foster ended with one final statement: Keith Whitley didn't just die from the bottle. He died because he was ready to talk. And maybe, for the first time in his life, someone was listening. In 2017, nearly 3 decades after Keith Whitley's death, an anonymous package arrived at the doorstep of a retired music archivist in Franklin, Tennessee. Inside was a weathered cassette tape, unmarked except for one thing: KW, Final, scrawled in faint pencil on the label. There was no return address, no note, just the tape and a simple warning written on a torn slip of paper. "Don't let them bury this again." The archivist, a former studio engineer who had worked with several Nashville legends, was stunned by what he heard. The tape began with a scratchy hum, followed by the unmistakable voice of Keith Whitley, not singing, but talking. "If this is the last thing I get to record," he said slowly, "then at least I get to say it in my own words." There was a pause. "They think I don't know what they're doing. They think I'll keep quiet, that I'll drink myself out of the way. But I've seen it, how they change the contracts, how they move the money, how they sign your voice away before you even know it." He went on, mentioning specific names tied to major publishing houses, managers, and even a radio syndicate. Keith spoke about a plan to form a coalition of artists who would demand transparency, to create a new label where writers and singers could actually own their songs. "They won't let it happen," he said, "not unless I disappear." Then silence. After nearly a minute of dead air, a song began to play. It was unlike anything the archivist had ever heard from Keith. Haunting, stripped down, and filled with cryptic lyrics. One line repeated, "When I'm gone, don't say I fell, say I was pushed," and no one yelled. The archivist, shaken, contacted a trusted journalist he had worked with in the past. But before the tape could be authenticated or released, it vanished. The journalist's car was broken into. The only thing stolen? His laptop, which had just received a digital copy of the recording. Soon after, the archivist received a legal notice stating that any unpublished Keith Whitley material fell under a retroactive ownership clause tied to a major Nashville label. The original tape was returned to him blank. The music, the confession, gone. And just like that, the most revealing artifact in the Keith Whitley mystery was erased from public memory. But a few who heard it remember, and they swear. Keith knew what was coming. He tried to warn us. But his final truth was silenced by the same machine he tried to escape. Keith Whitley's death was never supposed to be questioned. It was packaged, mourned, and filed away as yet another country tragedy. A man with demons who couldn't outrun the bottle. That's how they wanted the story told. Simple, sad, closed. But the deeper you dig, the more that narrative falls apart. The missing journal, the erased tapes, the anonymous phone call, the untraceable man seen leaving his home, and the chilling warnings whispered by Keith himself that he knew too much, and they knew he did. This wasn't just a man drinking himself into silence. This was a man trying to speak about corruption, about ownership, about the exploitation hidden in the heart of the music industry. And every time he tried to take a step toward freedom, something pushed him back. Until one day, he was gone, and the only witnesses left were the ones too scared or too silenced to speak up. In the years since his death, Keith's music has lived on. His voice still breaks hearts on radios and playlists. New artists still call him a godfather of emotional country storytelling. But the truth behind his final hours has never been fully brought into the light. It was too messy, too dangerous, too real. Because if Keith Whitley really was silenced, if his death was more than an accident, more than a bottle, then the industry that praised him posthumously may also be the same machine that buried him while he was still breathing. And the final gut punch? That the songs he fought to protect may now belong to the very people he feared most. Some say legends are born in tragedy, but others say tragedy is created, engineered to look accidental, sculpted to sell records and sympathy. And when it comes to Keith Whitley, the line between heartbreak and conspiracy has always been too thin to ignore. He didn't just sing about sorrow. He became the song they never wanted you to hear. And now, that mystery? It's finally solved, and it isn't good.